we typically have this format now where we go into a bit of a Q&A. So I really need you to be involved. I've got a shed load of questions. Travel risk management is not something that I would say I'm an expert on, but I know enough to know where to go to get the information, which is why I pulled together these three companies that are sat before you, and Nick, because I know his experience. But on the stage with us for this panel, I've invited Simon Crane along from AHNA Group, one of the directors of the ASC, because the company has developed a travel risk management qualification, which is shortly to be released. It fills a gap because ISO 31030 actually stipulates that people that do travel risk management should be qualified. And guess what? There is no qualification in travel risk management. So I've asked Simon to join us. I've also asked Charlie Frank to join us, who has recently launched his consultancy, having finished two big jobs as heads of security. When I first met him, he was leading security for the London Tideway Tunnel, which, if you're not aware what that is, the biggest sewer under the Thames, which is going to clean up the Thames, and probably I wouldn't sleep. If I was in charge of the security for that, I probably wouldn't have slept. And more latterly, and recently, head of security for JCB, with all sorts of threats, one of which was travel risk management. So, having heard his stories, I dragged him onto the stage as well. So, I think James Wood has joined us because Dr. Philippe has had to run away, but James has been at International SOS for the longest time. I think we met first back in 2017, probably, a good while ago. Justin Crump, the CEO of Sibylline, you met his remarkable young people earlier on today. And funnily enough, I haven't seen him since Milan in 2022, and yet he was at the train station in Andover yesterday while I was waiting to be picked up, and he was driving in I think it was you, in a remarkable little sports car. And yeah, could have been, say no more. And heading into London. So he is my bus. Comes never and then twice. Everybody else you've met on the stage, so I'm going to cut to the chase, if that's okay. So, we have addressed this idea of travel risk management in the precursor, in the event, and we've heard of different ways of how we manage in the event, and we've looked at the sort of recovery and the response to. So, I'm going to start off with a question, I think, which I'm going to throw into Nick. You started this off talking about silos. We know that security doesn't work well in silos. And then the travel risk management planning and where it sits and that impacted by silos. Can you just sort of elaborate a little bit more about what you meant by that? Because I was intrigued, but we didn't explore it.
Sure. Is this working? Yeah, good. I think the trouble with travel risk management is historically it hasn't really been one of those topics that everybody has thought about. It's only latterly, really, that people have begun to think about travel risk management as an independent subject. As a result of which, I don't think it naturally has been subsumed into any particular bit of the organisation. I personally feel that the global security, corporate security team is a great place for it to sit. But the most important thing is that wherever it sits, it has to be able to access the data. And to do that, you have to be able to work with, find out first of all who they are, and then work with the stakeholders who own that data. Now, the primary, I would suggest in this space, is the global travel team. At Deutsche Bank, the travel team had between the top three of them just under 90 years of experience within the bank. So you can imagine how receptive they were to change. In fact, one of them referred to me as a whippersnapper. which there's no need to laugh
Was this
quite
rec-
that
was
hard.
this recently?
Yeah,
Really?
yeah. So
Wow.
that gives you an indication. But the point I make is I had to develop and foster a relationship with these individuals because they were the primary source of the data that I needed to be able to effect a good travel risk management program. There are, as I alluded to in my presentation, I think there are a huge number of other stakeholders who have a significant interest in the program from across the business, operational resilience, business continuity, whatever you're calling it in your respective organization, legal, HR, and I was having this conversation just in the break beforehand, I think one of the other stakeholders that has to be engaged is the business lines, because ultimately they own that risk. Does that?
Yeah. And actually, Dave, my brother, and I were talking about this, you know, the complexities of everybody having a finger in the pie. I wonder if that's, you said before, that's not, you know, there is no one size fits all, and obviously there is no a stereotypical travel risk management department within a corporate security team. So if Charlie, for instance, and I'm going to come along to the suppliers of this in a minute to see how your experience is. So I think this is an interesting thread to pull. Is that your experience, Charlie? You know, everybody sticking their finger in and no one having sole responsibility?
I mean, certainly everyone's got an opinion once they've travelled and it's gone wrong for them. That's the quickest feedback you get on how resilient your system is. But I think it depends where you work and your organisation, how big it is. Quite often it will sit with the head of security, director of security, or within the health and safety team, the global health and safety team. But part of the challenge is where you work for the really big companies and they have regional offices all over the world. So you'll have a central booking function that they don't use.
Yeah.
So the sales reps will fly out to those regional offices and then they'll just go rogue. So you don't really know where that travel risk is lying. So what I found to be really useful was, in a convergent point of view, link in with the IT team and check where your laptops are logging on, look at the IP addresses from where they're logging on, see where they are in the world, and that's really useful to kind of build that intelligence of what your kind of regional offices are doing.
And what do you think about Nick's suggestion? He told us about the tip he was given yesterday for, refusing to pay expenses for people that are using services that they shouldn't be.
Absolutely fantastic. So,
is that something you see?
Linking your travel risk company with your travel provider is an absolute must. And I had the luck of working with International SOS previously. That's something we did, and instantly you saw the benefits of, you could, rather than seeing an employee lands at Geneva Airport and then you take a view of, well, what country have they gone to from there.
Yeah.
You can actually see where they're going if they've ticked the box for the privacy side of it. That with the travel risk assessment. But if you can link your expenses system to that, you will get much more compliance, and it stops the booking.com. Certainly one of the experiences that, I can share quite a few, but a young procurement lad, we had a new facility opening up in San Antonio. The supply chain's coming from Mexico. He thought it's absolutely fine to fly out there, use Airbnb, booking.com, and try and meet potential suppliers with no travel risk assessment, no security assessment, and that's where it starts going quickly wrong.
Yeah.
Because that's pretty cheap.
Yeah. So onto the sort of, we'll go down in order. I mean, what's your experience and the challenges of providing services? Who do you deal with generally? What opens the door for you? Is it security, or does it come through different avenues?
So from our perspective, I think I've been in international SOS for this is my 14th year now, and I think it's evolved hugely in that time. It is the Nick Hymans of the world. It's the corporate security leadership who are the ones who we have that Charlie and others who we have that strong engagement with. I actually think one of the current sort of trends we're seeing, and possibly one of the obstacles, is the role of procurement and the challenges around, obviously as a vendor providing services, but also as the way in which travel risk management is seen by the procurement department, which is it's all pounds, shillings and pence. It's all about cost control as opposed to risk management. So I think that's part of the challenge we see right now. but I think exactly to Nick's point as well, the evolution of the different stakeholders, HR playing a far more prominent role in the role of not just necessarily travel risk management, workforce risk management as well. And I think that's another interesting evolution we've seen is 10 years ago, when we talk about travel risk management, it is purely business travel or expatriation. Now, and certainly the pandemic has accelerated this, it could be wherever you're working, remote workers, digital nomads, it's you know, the whole scale of it has changed, so therefore HR is playing a far more prominent role as well. So I think it's a really interesting sort of evolved landscape we see of users.
I totally agree, and James, if I can just come, one of the catchphrases, whatever you want to call it, three-letter abbreviations that I've heard with increasing frequency is people risk management rather than travel risk management.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Justin, your company's working with a lot of big clients. Where do you see the challenges and you know the opportunities and who do you deal with?
In all this, I mean, it's an interesting thing though, because you say travel risk management, I think, isn't being done particularly well in a lot of places. As anywhere else, the bigger companies with bigger focus and a chief security officer are going to have more of a focus and less of a silo. They've got their own problems just because of the size. But it is interesting. I think travel risk is one of the things I've seen more commonly done by firms otherwise have pretty much dropped the ball on security and resilience. I think because there's a duty of care element, and as you mentioned, I mean, it comes in through HR. And there's a reason that, you know, ISOS is the size of company it is.
Yep.
And also, a lot of travel risk has nothing to do with security. I mean, what is it? Something like 98% of incidents are nothing to do with the security thing. Most of it's drunk Brits falling off balconies or jumping in the wrong end of the swimming pool. We know this. You know, that's what actually happens. And what's interesting is a lot of travel programs that we've seen don't actually focus on those risks, or actually the fact that most people get into trouble traveling around their home countries, you know, places. The US, people never we speak to big firms that never track domestic travel at all. And I remember I was when the Boston bombings happened, I was in the States and I was with a client and that blew up on the TV and I said, well, who have you got in Boston today? And I said, we've got no idea. There's a huge US company, so we don't track any travel inside the United States. You know, because nothing bad happens here. It only happens when you go to the DRC, right? That's the only place bad things happen to you. So it was... Yeah, that was really eye-opening. I know people are grappling with that. But again, it was ticking a box duty of care side. So, I mean, we're dealing with security functions that are trying to sort those things out and not scale it. We come across a lot of companies that don't know how to use intelligence at all, but do have a travel program. But that has been the success of CRI Source joint venture and things in the past, Anvil to an extent, and others that provided a solution, said, look, you must have this for HR compliance reasons. You know, if someone travels on your watch and something happens to them, that's a problem for you. And people do get, you know, mostly they were getting sick and had to be repatriated. But that was sort of an easy sell. And you could sell that to HR, you could sell that to any chief exec. Trying to argue you need a full resilience program and a security function, this is how to bring it together, is much more different. And that remains talking to the biggest companies. But they already sort of get it. And I think, especially for security consultants in this, it's helping this next tier of companies that in a more peaceful world that we once lived in, and we've seen the end of, sorry, my usual ray of optimism and sunshine, but at least you can go for a drink afterwards and get over it. But you know, we are at this pivotal time in human life, and actually the smallest companies, a bit like the old HSBC strapline that, you know, your kid's lemonade stand is global. I mean, that is actually now true, and even the smallest companies are going, especially if you account for Brexit, I mean, they're going overseas properly, you know, to do business even in our nearest neighbours. And I think that change means that they need to be taking it more seriously. This is an easy one because this is a duty of care. There is a standard. We can debate, and probably will debate the virtue of standards and everything else, but at least there is one. And it's something that people can actually understand and do something with. A lot of the stuff in security, they can't. IT security, they can. So guess what? A lot of money gets spent on it. They see the problems. They know who to go to. They get a solution. CEO sleeps at night. Travel, again, oh yeah, if someone gets hurt, and that whole workforce management, people risk thing, people get that. That's an easy sell. The more esoteric parts of resilience start getting to areas where, you know, how many small companies are exercising and testing themselves or even doing any sort of risk management? They don't have time. So this stuff's easy because you can pick it up and get it. If you use this, I think the point therefore being, and where we've used it, is to say, well, if you're doing all this, you can do more with this. And you can actually, if you're monitoring for things, you're monitoring for travel risk, you can monitor for other disruption that will affect your organization. And obviously things like the LA wildfires and stuff like that have extended. And of course, naturally, that's where your business has gone with things. And others, they say, well, actually, if we're doing this for you, we can monitor other threats. And now you've got a threat monitoring program, and then that could be useful for your reputational monitoring. And and it grows out. So where we see this, and the people we speak to, this is often a way in to get smaller businesses, by which I still mean, just outside the Fortune 500. I mean, they're big businesses that have nothing that we all know about, and that hopefully most of you speak to. It's a way in with them to kind of say, look, you must get this done. You don't even know where your people are on a given day. That's a nice thing to know when they're working remotely or from home. But actually on the back of that, couldn't you also do a lot of other things? And that, gateway drug in a way is how we see travel risk management.
Yeah, and so I'm curious as to what's the percentage difference between travel risk management to protect executives and travel risk management to protect the little people? Justin, just to follow on before I obviously speak to John. How much of what you do is to protect the C-suite, and how much of it is there to protect people that are travelling with the duty of care, or is that just oversight?
It's all of it, and the bigger problem is all the other people, and the classic again is travel in home country, people working where you don't know where they are. Something we've actually done quite a lot of recently, and in our own HR system, people can have nominated other points of contact. Because what we realised is that when disasters were happening in, say, Florida or Los Angeles, we'd contact all our staff in Los Angeles, we'd deal with all that, and it would turn out that someone's partner lived there with their kid, because they were separated, but their kid therefore lived in Los Angeles, and so they were heavily impacted, even though they lived in Seattle. Their parents are there, and that was having as big an impact on them. So actually it's the extension, again, to people risk management, because that affected their performance. I mean, they were safe, I'd fulfill my duty of care. They're in tears, sorry, I don't care, get to work. It doesn't work like that, does it? So the duty of care has got much wider and much woollier, without the people popping up in Venezuela, logging onto the system, things like that. You didn't realise had gone to work from somewhere remote that we've all experienced. The executive protection stuff tends to be very well covered because there's a whole team of people in the Fortune 500 dealing with it, and boy, are they really on edge right now, as you would imagine. Though also job security looking pretty good for those guys, and especially those who might be leaving the federal government shortly. So it's never a silver lining, but that's really well covered, but this feeds into it, but it's got to be really high level for that, because you can't tell us, send a CEO going somewhere to meet the president of Mexico, going in from the airport by helicopter, a generic risk assessment on Mexico, as if they were going to Cancun or something. Also, don't send people things saying Mexico is desperately dangerous and you can't go when they just had their wedding there. Because, again, it's one of those weird countries that's one of the most war-torn in the world, and yet you go there on holiday and spring break and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So there's a different audience, but actually the same things that make the CEO and his team roll their eyes will make your normal rank and file are rolling their eyes at some of the same stuff. Look, I'm from Nigeria. I don't need a country risk brief when I go back to see my family. But we also know that the person from Nigeria is going back to see their family is the one who forgets he's back in Nigeria, goes to an ATM at 2 in the morning and isn't seen again. Yeah. So, you can't fully escape it. The problem is the one size fits all for the juniors, if you like, in the company, and the average worker in the company is pretty frustrating. The CEO doesn't get that. They get a bespoke travel risk assessment, with exposure planning and mitigation windows, and when they're bundled in and out of the beast. And again, they're going by helicopter, only have 5 minutes, they're meeting the president. I think the more we can do for those people across the rank and file is probably the missing piece, maybe queuing up a further piece of debate. But travel risk ultimately is quite subjective. It depends on who you are, where exactly you're going, how experienced you are, what you're there to do, what your organization does. And that's the big changing thing, I think, in the state of the world right now is, particularly as the US suddenly becomes seen as the global bad guy properly, that you can see more targeting of people traveling on behalf of business for a US company, even if it's local to them. That's very hard to include in a generic off-the-shelf, you're going to a risk level 5 country. And also you might be going to risk level 5 country, but you've got a meeting at the airport and you're flying out again. Totally different risk profiles. And I think that's what we aren't getting right as best as we could do for more junior people in companies. We're seeing a big focus on that. LGBTQ traveling as well, different sorts of organizations. Google, wear whatever you want to work. Okay, I'm going to come to work dressed as a cat. Okay, you can do that at Google, but you've got a business meeting in Istanbul. You're probably going to get adopted by a family. So how do you explain that to someone? They say, well, I've got the right to wear whatever I want and be whoever I want at work. And you're saying, well, yeah, but maybe not if you're going on this business trip. That's incompatible with company values. So navigating those things is where I see the complexity for the wider workforce, especially in a world where people just think they can go, travel without borders, go wherever I want, work from the beach. It's all going to be fine.
Yeah. James, you look like you were about to...
Yeah, just to add on to that, the different sort of level of engagement. I think one of the worst culprits, or some of the worst culprits in organisations when it comes to travel risk management, are the C-suite themselves. Adhering to policy, we're working with an organisation in Sweden where I interviewed the general counsel, organisation 70,000 employees, asking about how they manage their sort of travel booking. And he would routinely go and drive 10 minutes to a local airport where there was only one airline flying from that airport, banned airline against their travel policy, but because it was 10 minutes away from his house, that's who he flew with. So it wasn't appearing any systems or anything like that. So I think one of the biggest challenges when you're sort of looking at C-suite versus the rank and file is it's the C-suite that don't adhere to that process.
Yeah, because
I do.
Yeah, all people are equal. Some are just more equal than others, right?
Right. Yeah. John, Peoplesafe is for the masses, for the little people, and its price. The price model reflects that it is a mass piece of software as a service. So, I mean, what are you had a lot of statistics up earlier on. What sort of statistics have you seen around companies paying out for breaches of? Do you have any data on that?
I think one of the problems with that is that organisations try and keep that as quiet as they possibly can.
Okay.
But it's funny, we've all been talking about the same kind of things. What drives the organisation to do this? And I think a lot of it is, for travel risk management, it does come from the top down more often than not.
Yep.
In our space, where it's safety, it's well-being, it's actually from the bottom up. And so it kind of meets in between the two. And I think that, when you start talking to businesses about corporate manslaughter, you start talking about actual culpability for not doing the right thing around your health and safety measurements that you put in place. It's difficult to get your health and safety manager or your security manager to take that to the top and risk their reputation by saying, by the way, we're not doing this right. I've told you we're not doing this right, and you need to do more, when there's so many other political things going on within organisations. So actually, we focus in a different way. We focus in on the business's core value, and we talk about how you measure against that. And that's typically through surveying staff. So the survey statistics that I showed earlier today, we asked around 15 questions, and some of them were to the organisation, and some of them were to the employee themselves. And the gap between the expectation of what people want and expect from their business as duty of care versus what the business thinks they're supposed to do is just wildly different.
Yeah.
And so I think showing the business that there is a gap through doing their own survey is an extremely compelling tool.
I'd be interested to know if you've seen your experience that following an incident, because we bury our head in the sand and we're blissfully ignorant most of the time around even marauding terrorist attacks in London. For the days afterwards, everybody stays and works from home because they're terrified, and then a week later they're walking around oblivious with noise-cancelling headphones on. Do you see a trend towards when there's an incident, everybody wants it, and then when they have to have it, maybe there's a challenge with privacy and, you're tracking me when I'm not at work? What's the balance?
When it affects the share price, then the people start thinking about doing something about it. So there was a really good example, probably 2011, Domino's Pizza. A delivery guy was finishing on his last shift of all time, going to go and do an IT job, had his own personal pizza that he was taking home, and somebody stabbed him and murdered him in his car in Sheffield for that pizza. So Domino's, being a customer of ours at the time, looking after their delivery staff, but actually for freight rather than personal deliveries, we went to the business because the business had said, we need to do something about this right now. Every single member of staff is talking about it, and our share price has dropped dramatically. Well, when they realised that the cost of our solution versus the cost of a death didn't equate, it cooled.
Yeah.
They simply didn't think it was worth doing. And that was before corporate manslaughter and the new HSC legislation and penalties came in. I think it's very difficult to compel an organisation to do anything unless they've got an incident that's happened, or there's likely incidents that could happen based on their sector and specifics they do.
This is the problem with our sector, is it's all carrot. There is no stick, because we don't have, beyond the front line, we don't have anybody regulating or stipulating what we have to do. Unless you're in critical national infrastructure where you're governed by Ofgem, Ofwat, whatever, or you're frontline SIA regulated, consultants. We could tell people anything we want to, and if they're willing to pay for it because they believe you, do what you want. And that's half the problem, what you're saying. I was interested in what you're saying about the culture. People are scared to stick their neck on the line to say, we need to do this as a health and safety lead or a security. And that kind of is indicative of a poor culture in a business where you fear coming up with good ideas. And that's an issue.
I think it's sometimes about trying to demonstrate that there are knock-on values to deploying a safety and well-being tool as part of your travel risk management. I think that businesses fail to realise that sometimes this investment washes its own face through what we talked about earlier, recruitment, retention. We have retention and recruitment calculators that we built based on statistics that show a business how much it costs you to lose somebody and how many as a percentage of your organisation in your sector would have left because of a safety concern. And you can extrapolate that out and say, well, look, actually, we'd likely be saving money. And that's the compelling piece. When a business hears that they're going to actually save some money and stick to their core values and improve the well-being of their staff, it becomes far more compelling.
Yeah. Simon, let me come to you, because we talked earlier on at 31,030 stipulates that somebody managing travel risk should be qualified in travel risk management. Now, I know that you and AHNA had picked up on this a while back. What instigated your desire to create that, and how does it look? How have you identified what are the key learning points in it?
Sure. So, firstly, I think we need to look at TRM as an enabler rather than, it's a really bad thing. Everything's going to happen that's bad to you. We look at it for, getting people into, as they call it, emerging markets. We call them war zones. We could get you into these places that you didn't think you could get into because we can manage the risk and get you in. Whereas a lot of people see travel risk management as a hindrance, and I don't want to get involved in that because it's going to stop me going to places. It's trying to change that mindset and get people thinking like that. From the qualifications point of view, I'll just clarify they're not AHNA groups.
Sorry.
I'm a director of another company called the Travel Risk Academy, which, Nick, I've just realised I've seen you on a Zoom meeting.
I realised earlier I met Nick in a pub. There we go.
So Travel Risk Academy are going to be the vehicle to get the qualifications out there and the courses that are coming out, hopefully at the end of this month. The whole ethos of it was to try and professionalise the discipline, because it's not really accepted as a discipline in its own right. And the siloing has caused that no one wants to take responsibility for it, therefore it's never developed as its own discipline. So the qualifications are aimed at a level 4 qualification aimed at day-to-day practitioners who are actually doing it, and then the level 5 qualification is aimed at program managers who are actually managing a travel risk management program. All based around ISO 31030 and demystifying it to an extent. There are a lot of charlatans in our industry, unfortunately, and I've seen lots of people that can accredit you against ISO 31030. You can't. ISO 31030 is a type B ISO, so you can't be accredited against it. It will become a type A, where you can be accredited against it. You can understand the guidance and you can be assessed against the guidance, and you can look at a travel risk program and say, actually, you're in line, you're complying with the guidance, but you can't be accredited against it. So part of my journey with these qualifications was getting them accredited. So they're now ATHI accredited, Awards for Training and Higher Education. They're the only 2 qualifications on the Ofqual register that are travel risk management qualifications. ATHI are a global organisation, so they can be recognised abroad, which is the big thing. But I say it was, believe it or not, altruistic. That travel risk management. I travel a lot. I get managed in terms of my risk. I see a lot of people travelling that have not got a clue. Don't get me wrong. The really experienced traveller can be a risk as well, because they get blasé and will take risks that they shouldn't really take. But there are a lot of very young, naive travellers out there now who have been working from home, who are now thrust into going to Saudi Arabia or into Africa, into some of the big projects out there. And if no one is looking after them that knows what they're doing, and it's great that we've got great companies like International SOS and Sibylline and people like that. A lot of the organisations that we speak to have not got a head of security, have not got access to your companies. They're sending individual travellers to really dangerous places. And it's trying to educate the travellers educate the people that are managing their travel, and the C-suite. And that's the C-suite is always the issue, is making them understand. The best travel risk management program is always saying, we don't send more than 3 people on a plane, but you'll send them all to the same hotel,
Right.
into the same meeting room. So everyone's very clever at the basics, but there is a lot to travel risk management that people don't think about.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm going to just come to the audience quickly to see if anybody has any questions now before I go into my second round of questions, having spoken to everybody. Is this raising? Mike?
Yeah, good afternoon, folks. I said to Nick when we came back this afternoon that what I knew about TRM you can put on the back of a postage stamp and still leave room for a CV. And I suspect that's probably true of a number of people. Justin mentioned something very quickly in one of his answers a moment ago. He mentioned the words testing and exercising. But we haven't heard anything in real terms so far today about testing and exercising. We all know that if this was a business continuity or disaster recovery conference, we would have heard about that a lot. We all know what happens to plans when they go into first contact. We all know that trigger events in travel risk management are best described as dynamic. So the exam question for you guys is, what does TRM plan testing and exercising best practice look like?
Where do you want to focus that first, Mike? You got a preference?
Well, Justin picked the mic up 30 seconds ago. So
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was looking the wrong way and it appeared. No, I mean, first of all, any testing and exercising to me shouldn't just be on TRM, because TRM is not really going to happen in isolation. If it is going to be something, it's about your drills. And actually what I'd say organizations do need to do, it's all very well, so I've got a TRM program, I've hired ISOS, tick the box. Something happens, there's a flow, someone's got to make a decision. God, no, that person's on leave. Okay, well, who's covering for them? Oh, I don't know. All right, so who's going to actually authorize this? This is, make the decisions that have to be made about the situation or something else. And it's having really sound processes, because otherwise you're just putting enabling systems and capabilities around a process that's fundamentally broken because no one answers the phone. That's even when there are some providers and who I've actually seen get their own things wrong. And I knew someone was in a crisis in Kenya and they phoned the emergency number on the card and it said, "Thank you for calling the X office. We are currently closed. Our opening hours are 9 a.m. till 5 p.m. Monday to Friday." It didn't even have press 1 if you were under fire in a shopping mall in Kenya. Press 2 if you want the SAS bloke who happens to be just down the street to come and get you. So it really was. I mean, they had a good laugh about it once they'd recovered. But it was one of those things. You're like, wow, that was just not a test of this. Oh yeah, we changed the phone number. We didn't issue new cards. And you're just like, right, okay. So there's basics on stuff. There's your internal SOPs and things. I think just within TRM, it's sort of like making sure that if you press the button for things to happen, that will happen, that organizations need to do. It's not just enough to hire ISOS and then go away and do it. Maybe it is, James, and feel free to correct me on it. But you kind of expect a degree of interactivity from the client to actually do things. But I also think it's the travel risk management aspects within a wider continuity plan. And this is where, again, I talk about this being the gateway drug. This is something that people do understand the need to have, and actually they get the duty of care. And you can say, okay, well, imagine when things are going wrong. And of course, Lebanon, Israel, recent events have done quite a bit to focus the mind, I think, as well, which helps in that. But think about the wider crisis. And of course, one of the things we know can happen in a travel crisis, and there's not a lot companies can do about this, is the fact that it's well set up that if you need to get someone home, you can charter a flight and do that. When everyone's trying to charter every available aircraft that insurers will allow to go into a war zone and pick people up, it all falls apart. Now, you can't deal with that purely within your TRM program, but you need to be thinking about the training, the options. What does shelter in place mean to the employees? People understand, what does that actually look like? What do you need to do for people sheltering in place? Or what can you do with your in-country staff? Another one is actually, what's your responsibility for your in-country staff that you're not evacuating? And how does that come into this plan? So I think, again, it's as part of a wider testing and exercising regime to challenge your thinking and your business resilience around something by using a flashpoint scenario crisis, intelligence-led, so it's credible, it's realistic, and saying, well, if that happened, what would we do? Okay, now let's check how would our suppliers operate within that? What are the blockers that could happen? What are we going to do about those? I did one of those people around Syria about 2 weeks before Syria went over, and luckily that was a comparatively easy thing, but they weren't sure. Their own exam question was, will the US stay in Syria under Trump? or actually are they going to suddenly disappear out of Afghanistan and our contractors working with the US military is going to be left in the desert, sort of wondering how to get home, which they felt because that had happened to them once already somewhere else in the world, right? So they said this is not an empty problem. And it was exactly that sort of thing. You know, it was actually really testing all aspects of the plan, having a plan B, and thinking it right through. And okay, travel is part of that. Obviously, that's a high-risk scenario, high-risk client, high-risk team. But I think you can take that approach to anything and then just think, okay, if Lebanon goes, how do we get people back? What are the options? What's the plan B? What are we hearing from our travel provider? Okay, what if they can't perform? Who are we going to call next? You know, what if someone doesn't heed the plan? And I'll give one example of someone who was left in Chernihiv in February, March 2022 for too long. And they've been ordered to evacuate, took too long, didn't want to leave the cats. You know, was stuck in Chernihiv, and I did know a group that managed to go in and get them out there. I mean, it fell totally outside the travel plan, the evacuation plan, or anything else. But, you know, how are you going to pick up a straggler, and who are you going to call then? And actually, the people who did that, just out of interest, they stole an armoured vehicle that was used by both sides, flew it through the Ukrainian lines with a Ukrainian flag on it, parked in the woods, swapped over to some Russian staff, drove through the Russian lines, you know, and that's how they got the person out. You know, they went into and out of a town under siege. And I must admit, I was asked, how are we going to get this guy out? And I said, well, I'm not going to do it. But I was like, this just sounds like one of those things you're not going to imagine, you know, where someone's going to manage to get them out, and they could. You couldn't test and exercise that, but at least knowing who you might call as your Hail Mary last hope, because this person's going to die in a city under siege option isn't bad to have in the back pocket. And again, that came out of previous thinking of, okay, if it really goes wrong, where's our bunch of lunatics with Black Hawks, you know, who for an insane amount of money are willing to do something totally nuts? You know, where do they fit into the plan? So just examples of where I've seen that testing and thinking and building of contingency come in around travel risk, but always linked to a wider scenario. Below that, it's SOPs, drills, but of course the more you can do, because the thing is, when it goes wrong, James, and maybe you can answer this though, when it goes wrong, you know, they're going to turn around and say it's ISOS's fault. You know, we contracted with you to deal with this for us. You're like, yeah, but you didn't answer the phone. You didn't authorize the checks. You didn't follow your own protocols. Your own information you sent us was out of date. Contact lists were out of date. You know, lay down to your company was out of date. And I think it's that engagement, which to be a successful vendor, you've got to drive, right? Because otherwise people get lazy. That I suspect is the key to that.
Yeah, and you know, I think all extremely valid points from Justin there. I think one of the challenges with exercises and testing is it's all about when something goes wrong. And I think actually within travel risk management, that's quite hard to do. To exactly Justin's point is something going wrong is typically going to be a security event, a medical incident that you're going to have to get people out of the country. Where we have seen some of the most effective travel risk management exercises hasn't actually been in that. It's been in exercises like running a courtroom scene, having the CEO sit in a fictitious courtroom to talk about what they did to demonstrate and exercise their duty of care obligations. You will never see a CEO squirm more under situations like that where they are being grilled on how their organization dealt with a situation similarly to that. So I think actually the whole aspect of exercising within TRM needs to be sort of turned on its head. I think another aspect that we've seen is also it's not just about the risk, it's about the whole travel life cycle, the experience that the traveler goes through. The running exercises and workshops, bringing in the actual travelers themselves is worth its weight in gold. And it's wonderful to hear Simon talk about the training and for the travel risk management practitioners, which I think is long overdue. Because I do think that's those types of situations where you're testing people through putting them through fictitious situations, but actually what you're doing is trying to enhance their day-to-day role as opposed to purely focusing on an incident. Because the reality is most organizations have experience of going through incidents. They can usually muddle their way through, or they've got someone who's involved in an incident before and therefore has a bit of individual knowledge. But it's where actually it's testing around the duty of care principles, the ISO itself, the travel experience. You're going to get far more return on investment by running those types of exercises than you would be a traditional incident management exercise, I think.
I agree, and I think there's a great phrase that came up at the Security Leaders Conference last summer, which the General said was, you know, in a crisis we don't rise to the occasion, we sink to the highest level of our training. That really resonated with me. I think I'm going to come to Charlie now, but Nick said something in his presentation about if you're going to deliver training, it needs to be easy to absorb. Now, what's the difference between a travel risk briefing and travel risk training for a traveller? Does it all come down to the environment they're going to? Is it about the crisis management team, and how you realistically deliver that? I mean, training is for the traveller and training for the manager at the home base that's managing that crisis. There's a whole raft of courses to be had there. Charlie, how did you cope with that? And in CMT, did you ever cover travel risk management in CMT exercises?
So just on the previous point, as well as exercising, I think assurance of your third-party supply chain is critical, because before that crisis starts, if you're one of your company directors, or more importantly, an executive PA can't make their flight, they're delayed, and none of the numbers out of hours are working, that's a bigger crisis than someone dying somewhere for you as a chief security officer, because it's your fault, it's on your toes. But can you just
training? So you obviously you'd have run crisis management exercises, and how often is travel risk on that sort of agenda for the exercises you do?
So again, it depends on the company you work for and their appetite. So Tideway, 4 exercises a year across, your risk register, exercising against the threats in your risk register, of which some is travel risk management. Back to the individual brief part of the question, or the wider travel risk management piece. In most organisations I've worked for, the individual brief is specifically for people who are sent to those higher risk areas, such as, if you're opening an office out in Kenya, which, has happened, and, it's more about the families, how they live out there, how they behave. They get that training from a third-party training provider, and then the rest of it is down to your travel risk management programme against your policy. But again, if you're not assuring that policy, there's going to be gaps in it, even in a year's time. So I think that's critical, really.
Yeah, Nick, when you alluded to training should be kept simple, is this evolved beyond what you were suggesting, or were you just talking about sort of travel briefings?
I was specifically talking about the individual travellers training.
Yeah.
Because, as I alluded to, there are so many, particularly in the financial services sector, there are so many compliance trainings that people have to do that they would. And there was a study done, and this is slightly different, but humour me. There was a study done within one of the organisations I worked with, that if an average person reading at an average speed read through from 9 o'clock in the morning till 5 o'clock at night, all of the policies that annually they ticked a box and signed saying they've read all of these policies that are applicable to me, it would take them roughly between 8 and 9 months of the year. So all of these individuals are signing this, glibly saying, yep, I've read all these policies and I promise to adhere to them. And the same is true of the compliance training. And that's what I was trying to get across, is whatever training you put in place as a travel risk management professional, as an organisation working with a corporate, it has to be sufficient length of time to get the points across, and that'll vary from organisation to organisation, but definitely not so long that people just go to sleep or just pay lip service to it, because then it's not really worth it.
So Simon, is it make it interactive?
I think make it consequence driven.
Right.
Yeah, make people understand what their decisions mean in the real world and what the consequences of their decisions are. And that court scenario is a great scenario. That, you get your C-suite to make a decision, and the next scenario is, right, thank you very much, now we're in court, because you've made a decision that's landed us in court.
Yeah.
And the travellers themselves, they will make decisions that are against company policy or against what they've been briefed, and they need to understand the consequences of that. And the consequence might be that they're not covered, and they're not insured, and their medical fees might be paid by themselves.
Yeah.
I do agree with you. Sorry, James, so I'll give you a sec. But I do agree, and I think there's one specific area that's been really good at this for a number of years, which is KNR. KNR has been really, really good at training and exercising to a very around, not quite a courtroom level, but consequence training. And that's a model that is really easy to follow.
But KNR is, probably the most infrequent risk that travellers face. A car accident is probably the most common.
Completely agree with you. I'm just talking about the model.
I'm agreeing with you, but we put all that effort into KNR, but we don't put the effort into what are the real risks that that we need to manage.
One of the things that I think with training and in TRM in general is obviously the traditional view is very much it's duty of care. It's the obligations, it's the organisation's obligations to protect the employee. I think one of the things that we're seeing, and I think one of the things I'm trying to push for more open debate in, is duty of responsibility. So organisations put in place a huge amount of process, policies, structures to reduce the risk to the employee. But to exactly what Simon was saying, they may choose to have completely opposite behaviours or not adhere to that or not read the process or policy. So I think the duty of responsibility has to be seen to the same level as duty of care within organisations. It has to be very much the employees understand their obligations and their responsibilities. So otherwise, it just becomes, to Nick's point, I'm just going to tick a box because someone else will look after me if something goes wrong. So I think there needs to be an evolution in that space as much as anything else as well. So that's something I'm keen to push more in the industry.
That's a really interesting point, because when I was thinking about when we were talking about training, I mean, the amount of stuff I see on social media with people like how to stay safe in hotel rooms. And there's a series of increasingly insane things that they do that bear no relation to actual safety. But the degree of paranoia amongst younger travellers about safety and security in hotels is actually very high. There's obviously a real desire to watch these videos and all these things where people are checking the mirror carefully to see if it's covered in cameras and, triple wedging the door and everything else like that. And then, of course, they just give up and go and stay at a completely unlicensed, unregulated Airbnb down the road where anyone's got the keys. At the same time, there's this weird combination between excessive paranoia coupled with absolute, but it's convenient for me, and therefore actually all this, I'm sort of aware of, and it's actually the same as people's attitude towards being online. We have younger generations that are more cognizant than ever of the bad things that happen online and everything else, and yet are way more irresponsible online than previous generations at the same time. And it's the same with travel, because at the same time they go to places and do crazy things, even though they absolutely know they shouldn't. But I think there is therefore an appetite, I think, for safer training if it's couched in the right terms. And it does appear to be like when it's threat-led and it feels very relevant to them. I think if it doesn't feel particularly relevant, then they don't accept that. And I think what doesn't really wash is terrorism as a threat to people. Now, the Americans, it's different. I was aware of one company that sent its executives from the US to the UK for a university course. So they came to Oxford and they sent their European and British people across to Philadelphia for theirs. And guess which one the CSO had to go and sit with the executives on in case a knife-wielding armed terrorist burst into the room in Oxford, that very, very dangerous location, and took everyone out. In the meantime, when the people going to Philadelphia said, well, why do they need anything? It's safe here. And so the other execs were like in the back end of Philly, in a very dangerous local environment. They didn't understand. So, it's sort of it's weird with the US as to what they perceive threats to be, and it would be a different sell to the US sometimes. But I think younger generations don't accept that terrorism is what they should be worried about, but they're very worried about someone spying on them in the bathroom. So actually, if you build training, though, it's more about your personal safety, and, especially therefore, I think training for female travellers and stuff, there's a lot of traction for that. And I think you have to use those hooks, though, to work it into something that occurred to me when we were talking about it.
Do you know, it occurs to me that the irony of the fact is that the sector I've seen do the most travel training, or travel risk training, is the sector that has the least amount of money, and that's the charity sector. The NGO sectors are running hostile environment training, pre-deployment for every member of staff, because they're going to really dangerous places in general, and yet they're the charities are the ones that arguably have less money than others. Do you have experience of this? Obviously is a need pushed. It's pushed because it's necessary, and there's a duty of care is felt more keenly, maybe. I don't know. Do you work, anybody work with the charity sector as to why they're so much more ahead of the curve than corporates? John, you just picked up Mike. You got that?
Sure. So we work with a wide range of different charities, whether they are UK-based or international travellers. And I think that one of the reasons, and don't forget, we're talking more about a boots-on-the-ground sort of training than we are top-down. It's about changing people's perception of risk and managing dynamic risk assessment. And if your tools and technologies that you deploy don't encourage any of that and rely on intuition and the person's knowledge of their own risks and safety, it's going to fail. You have to have the technology to back it up. And as long as it encourages it, and the business can also review it, report on it, show that people are using it, and if not, encourage them, use that carrot and stick approach of, look, we care enough about you to give you this technology, but the stick is, it's part of your policy that you adhere to, and we can see that you're using it appropriately. I think doing those two things can really make a big difference to habitual change to risk management at the employee level.
Yeah, James, before you respond to that, there is a phrase, Peter Drucker, I only came across this the other day again, but he says, what can be measured can be managed. So how do you measure people's capability in a crisis and therefore manage it if you don't get the appropriate level of training, right? But with that in mind, where were you going with that?
I wasn't going that way, but I will.
All right.
But no, I think it's a fair point. And I think just on the charity sector, we work with a lot of charities, NGOs. And I think it's also to do with the fact that their principle of risk management is risk acceptance. And actually, as traditional security structures are a barrier to them doing their work. So they can't just, roll up in Central African Republic with fleets of B-6 armoured vehicles and sort of paramilitary groups supporting them because they cannot physically do their work.
Right.
So I think the acceptance of training is far higher because it actually enables them to do their work in a better way.
Yeah.
I also think, to your point around sort of being able to measure that success, I think they see it far more as directly linked to their success in the field as well. It's much harder in a corporate environment to be able to say, well, because I went through this travel risk training, I took the right taxis and I did the right things in a hotel, because it's not as measurable. Whereas if from the charity sector, I was able to succeed in this project in the Central African Republic because I undertook that training as well. So I think actually, to your point, I think that is the ability to measure success far more tangibly through that training piece as well.
Yeah.
That was the point.
Right, actually, like doing scenario-based vehicle hijack checkpoints, stabbing or robbery. We did this with a bunch of kids back a couple of years ago, volunteer police cadets, and took them through these scenarios, and it was really good training. Blank firing, pyrotechnics. It raised the ante. It put some stress into that training, and that I felt was realistic for travel training. But if it's all theory, is that enough, Simon? I mean, in your training, are you any role-based, scenario-based, or is it all awareness?
So it's teaching the travel risk managers to use that sort of training. So we look at how they train the different people in their organisations, how they train the travellers, how they train the C-suite, how they train the different departments within their organisation that deal with travel, and to bring them all together. And then we look at testing and exercising as a separate piece. Testing, exercising from start to finish, pre-deployment, during deployment, post-deployment. How do you recover? How do you debrief? All those sorts of things. So it's got to be a holistic. It can't be we do this bit of training. It's got to be across everybody, and very, very much I hate one size fits all. Yeah. Everyone does it because it's easy. But it can't be.
Has to be specific to the environment they're going into, surely. Going into Syria is going to be very different to going into Cape Town.
Well, just to James's point about restriction, when I worked in Libya, we were in soft-skin vehicles with local drivers. The EU, the UN were in convoys that could have invaded a small country. And caused lots of problems and couldn't operate the way we did because they were upsetting the locals, basically, because they caused chaos whenever they went out.
This is where the intelligence-led comes. And actually, James just reminded me of something. I was at a CP technology conference last Friday, listening to a presentation from a media security team who were relaying a story where they were out with the talent, the news broadcaster, who was a Sudanese, a young woman of Sudanese descent, so North African looking, sort of, which is more Muslim than the sub-Saharan Africa. But they were on the border between Rwanda and Congo. And the Congolese army had just given a load of Belgian mercenaries like their last marching orders, get out. And this news team got targeted because she was kind of Hutu looking in her sort of appearance or ethnicity, and these were Tutsi leads, that were kicking off. So they zeroed in on it. Now, the question I had for the team leader from that deployment was, well, you're dealing with the, how these reporters work with a security team. The security team is briefed on how they work with the talent and not restricting them getting their story. But who decided to put a woman into a war zone where she looks like the enemy of the people that are perpetrating? Now, this is an intelligence lead. So for you two guys in the middle, who talks to these people that says, whoa, think about your reporter you're sending in, you're probably better putting a European-looking person in here because they're not going to be seen as a threat. Is that common?
You guys have to be very careful about it. I think when sort of framing the threat assessment thing, it's important to be objective within that. As in, this is where I said actually the travel risk itself is fundamentally subjective. Because also they might look and be like one of the people from there because they grew up in that area, they know it well. But of course then they're proxy to the conflict. But there's pros and cons to everything, and ultimately that's the business's decision. And you have to be very careful about pointing it out, because then that can be seen as actually you're promoting discrimination. So the business is very worried about that, and ultimately, look, the President of the United States can go and visit anywhere he wants on the planet, perfectly safely if you expend enough resources. So you can send anyone anywhere to do anything. I mean, what you're then doing is increasing the threat profile, and therefore you might have to take extra steps. So what we tend to do to highlight a situation a bit more like that, said, well, of course you can do this, but if you do that, you will need to think one bubble further, or it's going to increase your risk profile. So we use quite a lot of, you're more into executive protection, high risk travel at this point, and then you're using much more exposure graphs and things and saying, well, actually this sort of person draws more. And often, again, if you're sending a black correspondent to Africa, A, they're probably going to be able to do the job better, B, they're actually a lower threat because they don't stand out. You start to see the advantages as well. So I actually more often see it cut the other way. Again, though, the risk being that people with some local knowledge but who've got a bit blasé is that the fact that then, of course, they are blasé about the risk when they go back somewhere and they sort of forget. And I actually had a friend I worked with in banking who was Colombian, and he was working in New York, and he went back home, went for a night out, basically forgot he wasn't in Manhattan anymore, went around the corner to the ATM and has not been seen again. So, and that was 20-odd years ago. Right. So, it happens because he just forgot the rules of the game when he was back at home. So we encounter that little bit as well when looking at it. So, but just to go back to that earlier point, I think, heat training is great. It's obviously more expensive than a 45-minute PowerPoint about safe traveling. There is also a risk, and we had this with an accountancy firm that was auditing NGOs, and the people that went out to do it felt like they were heroic NGO workers and combat accountants and were sort of going to parachute in and be out in the bush living like Lawrence of Acauntia or something. And the sort of thing that was sort of developing. Eventually you had to go, no, you're a very boring white-collar city worker. You don't really need to be leaving the head office. You don't need to be going out to site, particularly that nice site we've all read about that has a wonderful view of the lake in the morning and wildlife wanders through it. Yeah, you don't need to go to that site to see how they're doing things, really, when you're auditing the books. So actually there was a bit of remember that you're not an NGO worker, and actually you don't need heat training, because if we give you the heat training, you're going to put yourself in the adventurous situations because you're going to claim you're trained for it. So sometimes those two ways of dealing with things. NGO workers, you're going somewhere dangerous, you've got to be able to survive. We'll equip you to survive in your environment, versus we have to project a bubble of safety around you that keeps you as safe as you would have been in, I don't know, the City or Canary Wharf at your desk. And so we have to the only way you can do that is legislate, assure, put rules in place, versus, hey, when you get to the country, you're going to be more or less on your own, and therefore we need to teach you how to survive. I think that's where I see that dividing line in what we're trying to actually teach people. In a way, if you teach them too much about how to survive, it's like one of the reasons the British Army doesn't train in close quarters combat with knives and underwater grappling and stuff, is because then people will try and do it. And we point out, you've got an awful lot of weapons on you. Try using those first before you do kung fu. just use the weapon, shoot someone. It's much better and a more effective way to win a fight. Yeah, and it's the same with this, it's just use the gun. And it's the same with this stuff. It's like, we don't need to train you to survive. You don't put yourself in a position where you are trying to filter water out of the ground using sticks and, walk 400 miles through the wilderness and write a novel about it. Just don't get in that position. And that's a 45-minute lesson, not a 45-day one.
Yeah.
I think complacency's come up quite
Yeah.
a bit, and as
Yeah,
a CSO, complacency certainly within your C-suite impacts where travel risk management sits on your strategic threat and risk register, and it's about influencing that change, so you can carry out your exercises. Because if it's not in your top 10, the training budget's not going to be there. The time for training is not going to be there, and the time for exercising isn't going to be there. So one of the ways of trying to influence that change is, where the higher risk travel is, or the exceptional travel is, most people forget to check the insurance policy of the company. Because if the insurance policy doesn't cover the travel, you've got big problems, because no one's coming to help because it's not covered by the insurance.
That's really interesting, because I was going to come to you both as heads of security here, because Nick said something earlier on about legal phraseology and how they work around, who's liable for what, and I think you said something similar to we will not tolerate a zero appetite for preventable risk events, or something similar to. So they're not saying no, they're saying we'll have zero tolerance for a preventable. Now, that is a big finger in the air, right? Because anything could have been prevented to a degree with a lot of resources, as Justin said, but what's a reasonable allocation of resources to mitigate a preventable risk? And second to that, and I'll come to Charlie as well, when that happens and somebody gets hurt or killed, is the CEO responsible as they would be for duty of care under Health and Safety Act? I mean, is that how you bring more stick and less carrot?
You've got a piece of string,
Uh-huh.
because that's got to be the answer to the first question.
Yeah.
Because what is preventable is, and the word subjective has been bandied around on the
Yeah.
stage earlier on, that is a massively subjective question that only the organisation can determine, and it's all linked together. So training through operational resilience scenarios to determine what that acceptable level, preventable level is, but there's always going to be stuff that comes out of left field. And this is why, when I was talking earlier about Plan B, and the guys on the stage have been talking about Plan B as well, you have to have that Plan B, because even if an incident is preventable but still happens, if you are then in an environment where you can respond effectively to it and remove the individual from harm, then no harm, no foul, for want of a better expression. So it's a massively difficult question that I can't answer. Mm-hmm. What constitutes a preventable incident? It depends who's travelling, where they're going, what they're doing when they get there. All of the stuff that everybody on the stage has already discussed. Mm-hmm. And then it's down to my pet crusade, as I mentioned earlier, the individual risk assessments of that specific travel.
Yeah.
But what's a preventable incident? And we've been talking quite a lot about high-risk travel. You've only got to look at London Bridge, the Bataclan attacks in Paris, the market attacks in Frankfurt, in Berlin. These are not high-risk destinations. And yet all of these incidents have occurred. If you're caught up in that, would that have been a preventable incident? Mm-hmm. I don't know. And so I can't.
Charlie, who's to blame if it goes wrong?
Well, I mean, ultimately, the CEO signs off the policy.
Right.
They own the policy. It doesn't matter who writes it. I think if you want a policy that's going to stand up to scrutiny, one, it's got to define your risk appetite. So regardless of whether it's a security policy or a travel risk policy, it's got to define the company's risk appetite within that policy statement. If it doesn't, there's no kind of benchmark. I think, from my point of view, if you want a policy that's any good for your company, you've got to look at two aspects. The traveller's journey, and put yourself in their position, because to Simon's point, you want to be an enabler with that policy document to promote good culture and practice. but the traveller will see you as an obstacle because you're putting barriers in front of their journey that's already stressful.
Yeah.
From the other point of view, you want to be the C-suite looking back at how do we recover from these worst case scenarios and what impacts our reputation, share value. You know.
Yeah.
I really, if I may, I really like the idea of a courtroom with putting the CEO on the stand and saying, this is a realistic scenario that could happen if you don't sign off the travel risk management policy to an appropriate level, to your point, Charlie. And I think that's a really good way of getting that visibility of the problem, because the risk register, the top 10 risks for most organisations, travel risk, is probably going to fall outside that top 10. If we're honest, and stick my hands up here, I look at the top 10 risks for both Credit Suisse and Deutsche Bank, where I was, and travel risk management would fall way down below. But the implications, the personal implications for the CEO, and that requirement for them to potentially have to take the stand if they haven't done everything that constitutes reasonable practicality, then they suddenly sit up and pay attention.
I think, sorry, also from our members' point of view, if they're providing advice to a CEO on travel risk management, you know, a great thing to say to them, would you prefer to be standing in the witness box on your own or with me standing next to you and helping them with what we did?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's a very having done it myself, it's a very lonely place in a witness box. But if you've got a piece of paper or you know that someone's coming up behind you to give evidence behind you that's going to support what you've said, then that's a much more comfortable place to be.
Just on the sort of the courtroom aspect as well, we launched a white paper on duty of care in the UK in October last year, and we did so in conjunction with Herbert Smith Freehills, and it was interesting to get their perspective of it. And I think sometimes the risk when we talk about legislation and punitive issues that could impact the CEO is it's all bad. Actually, the legislation that is in place isn't designed to catch organisations out. It's designed to be there to really help reinforce what is practically reasonable and what organisations should do. If you can demonstrate that in a court of law, you're not going to prevent all risk. You're not going to stop anything from happening. And I think that's sometimes where organisations almost suffer a bit of paralysis from, is they get so wrapped up in, if something happens, we are going to court. Actually, the view is, no, you've got to do what is reasonably practicable to manage. And I think that's, again, the message around travel risk management is not that it's about avoiding risk, because you're not going to avoid any risk or stop any risk. It's about how do you put in place effective frameworks, structures, governance to empower not just the employee but the organisation to demonstrate their duty of care. And I think that's the sort of, I think, the shifting narrative we need to have.
This is what you were talking about, Simon, being in the witness box, but having someone behind you who can effectively demonstrate that.
Well, if you think of where it's gone wrong, so hopefully not calling anyone in the room or anything else, but TUI in Tunisia, you know, there had already been attacks on tourists, it was unstable, telling people, no, it's fine, it's all safe, you can go ahead with the booking. Because, I mean, that becomes negligence. That becomes, you know, pretty clear cut. Now, when there's a standard, of course, it's much easier, because if you follow a standard, at the end of the day, you're legally defensible. If you do not follow a standard that's laid out, you have to explain why you chose not to bother. You know, that's a bad place to be. But when there isn't one at all, it's a bit more difficult. And the problem with all risk assessments is ultimately you have a column, it says, you know, risk, threat, impact, everything else, original figure, risk mitigation, residual risk, acceptable, yes, no. And at some point, someone is signing off the risk, and actually the UK in particular is terrible at getting anyone to sign off that final bit of risk, and therefore we don't do anything. It is a feature of life in the UK, and actually quite a lot of Europe, I think. We don't take the risk sometimes. Or people just don't bother with the process because it's such a nose, and you're signing at the end of it to say you accept, you know, terrible consequences. And people say, I rather wish we hadn't done the whole process, because then I was much more comfortable until we did this process, and now I'm petrified. I've read everything can go wrong. And then you don't make a decision. And you know, the reality is, we did everything we could. Someone died in a terrorist attack. They're a victim of terrorism. Probably, you know, let's blame the terrorists for going around killing people. If you're absolutely blasé, someone dies in a terrorist attack, it's much, you know, we're not putting the terrorists in the courtroom, are we? So it's much easier to come after you. The lawyers will bring everyone into it. And it comes down to a red face test. It's like, we did everything reasonable, and I will stand and defend that. And a judge will look at that, and everyone's like, oh, go to court, you'll be destroyed. Judges are looking at it and saying, did this company do what was reasonable or not? And if they clearly ignored advice, didn't follow up, and they will come out and say, well, I mean, what do other companies do? What are expert witnesses, or, you know, many of you in the room, you know, what are expert witnesses going to say? And they'll say, well, big companies of this kind have a travel risk management program. Oh, what are the features of a program like that? Well, luckily there's an international standard. Here it is, look, and it shows you exactly what you should be doing. Oh, right, did you do any of that, CEO? Oh, no, we didn't really. Okay, well, now you're in trouble. If you go, yep, we followed it. We didn't completely follow it because some of it didn't work, and but we documented where we changed from that, and actually this person was in charge. And at the end of the day, a bad person came around, shot one of our travellers. Can you feel sorry for their family and for us? We're victims here. That you'll win that. I mean, judges aren't unreasonable and expect the CEO to magically waive away all risk, right? And I think that is an important point. You know, I think really comes out when you look at these cases. You know, and it's been harder before. And the double-edged sword of having a standard is, you know, you've got to at least follow that or explain why you didn't. Yeah. But that's the good side of it. Is now CEOs can't get away with it because of the Chewy case. There was nothing to really. There's no intelligent standard. They could legitimately say, well, we didn't know. What did the FCO say about it? You know, and you can kind of get round it and say, well, how are we meant to know what to do, Judge? I mean, we did our best. You know, we can show you some emails we sent about things. Once this exists, people have got to kind of really respect it, if not follow it. And it will throw up things like it says a suitably qualified person must do it. Oh, there's no qualification whatsoever. So how are we meant to do that? You know, we're now saying if your risk person isn't qualified to lead travel. Therefore, you can do no travel at all until they've gone through your course. Well, I mean, that's clearly ridiculous as well. Yeah. But people should look at it and say, well, when can we sort that out? We have a roadmap. What are we doing in the meantime? Who are we speaking to? We have a reliable partner. They are experts. We work with them to de-risk our program. You're not going to take it to zero. Yeah. Simon, you look like you were poised.
Yeah, no, I was going to support that. I mean, it's already 31030 is already being used by defence lawyers to say to people, have you followed the guidance? We understand it's not a standard. You can't be accredited against it, but it's guidance. And people have obviously thought it's serious enough that we need to develop one. So why haven't you followed the guidance? And if you do follow the guidance, the likelihood is you won't end up in court. It will be settled out of court because you've followed that, and the defence lawyers will see it and realise that there's no case. So,
I have a question for James and possibly Justin as well. How are you coping with clients, customers that are just basically sticking two fingers up to the standard and saying we're doing this our own way, despite your best advice? Are you coming across that as a problem?
Not as much as you'd think, actually. I think there are organisations that are scared of standards, full stop. Yes. And therefore another ISO is anathema to them because they don't want to go near it. But when you actually dig into the processes that they have in place, there is general alignment, and that's when they start. The sort of the ball starts to drop when they go, okay, we're already doing this. We could just tweak it a little bit here and there. Then we can start to demonstrate full alignment. So I don't necessarily think we're seeing, and I think our clients are invested in travel risk management because they bought our services. So therefore, there is a degree of acceptance that we need to do this. I think the challenge comes in organisations that don't have a travel risk management capability, either externally or internally, is this has never happened to us, so why should we have this? Or we have insurance, therefore insurance will tackle this. That, I think, is a bigger problem than non-adherence to a standard. I think it's the insurance will tackle this, or it's even worse, a CEO saying we've never had an issue.
And it's an issue you can't insure your way out of, basically.
No.
It's not something you can just go, yeah, we're insured.
If I could, I'm going to try and draw to a close now, an hour and 15 minutes in. I'm going to ask each of you for a nugget of information. That might be a resource that you have that you can share, that people can find more information. It might be your best tip for individual travellers, for, you know, my kids travelling Far East post-university. Have a think. I'm going to open to the floor because you all came here, you know, to learn something about travel risk management. And is there anything that you wanted to hear about that didn't come out during this morning or this panel that you would like to ask now? Now is your opportunity. Okie doke. So I'm going to go from Simon first, and we come this way. Give us your best.
So from the evolution of ISO 31030 is now 31031, which is for schools and universities, basically. So rather than the one-size-fits-all approach for organisations, there's now a specific one for schools and universities. Hugely high-risk travel. You know, they're taking groups of our kids away without us And they've now got to show a duty of care for that as well. So just be aware of that. If you do any work with schools and universities at that travel risk management, ISO is coming in as well.
Well, I'm a governor of a school, and they did just have a trip to Madrid, and I could have done with that information a week ago. John.
I would say if you are struggling to compel your senior leadership team to look at safety of staff as part of travel risk or independent of that, I would suggest that a steering group would be the best way to go about doing that, involving everybody from your lone worker or vulnerable staff all the way through to your chief people officer or head of HR, director of security. Get them all in the room and get a sense check of what's the reality for boots on the ground. And I think it will help you steer that conversation in the right direction when it comes to going cap in hand and begging for a bit of cash.
Yeah, great advice. Thank you. Justin.
There's quite a few nuggets we've given out during this. The one I would bear in mind, a lot of the assessments around stuff like travel risk and things can be quite static. If I think of some of the models that are out there, and it's no criticism of anyone on stage, we've got some of these things, they're inherently sometimes very simplistic. Countries are risk rated 1 to 5, you know. We're in a very volatile environment where a lot of things can change very quickly, as we've seen. And I think within that, it's really important that the intelligence picture around a lot of this stuff needs to be really up to date. And we need to think a lot more about what could go wrong during a trip that changes the environment rather than what's the risk level of where you're going, okay, here's training based on that, off you go, have a nice time. Because as we've seen, you know, things can change dramatically when people are away, and especially if it's a longer trip, a longer deployment, you know, there can be some really big changes. And I think it's still sort of seen somewhat by people I see using it, partly because they've got great systems and things behind them, but it's kind of a threat level is this, you know, their process flows through, it gets signed off by X person, and it doesn't take into account just how much things change. Again, it's about people going to the DRC or, you know, somewhere where it's a relatively static high threat, not a potentially dynamic volatile threat. It's a silly example, but going to Dubai at a point where all airspace could have been closed over the Gulf, where there could have been a full-on war with Iran erupting at any point, you wouldn't say you can't go just based on an objective assessment of travel risk in Dubai in isolation. It was kind of like, but what could go wrong while you were there? How will you get you back? So I think in this particular environment, it needs wider thinking. And also the point I made before, I mean, the threat assessment should be objective. The travel risk is subjective. And again, it's great to get the help from firms that help you with this. You can't treat everyone like the CEO and give them a level of executive protection, but the more you can move towards something that accommodates different types of travelers, different types, you know, takes into account the background of a traveler or anything else, because their risk will be individually different. That's where we need to be. And when you have the chance to help build systems like that, I think that's grand. Easy to say, quite hard to do, but there are ways you can improve a system that already exists, even if it's only offering additional resources for certain classes of traveller. And very side note, BA offer a get comfortable with flying course, because a lot of people aren't even comfortable with flying. You send them off on a business trip, they don't want to get on an aircraft, especially if they watch the news over the last month. And they, you know, stupid stuff like that, but offer those resources. I think 60,000 people have done it. That's a lot of nervous flyers that BA put through that program. Hopefully not all pilots and flight attendants.
Brilliant, thank you. James.
I think from my side, I'd actually advocate for John's idea as well about steering group. I think getting that C-suite buy-in is the best starting point to really drive an effective TRM program. My other point, I think, is I think we should advocate for this not being travel risk management, but being workforce risk management. And I'd love if Rick decides to invite us back next year, that this is a workforce risk management debate and a discussion, because I actually think the landscape's changed so much compared to when TRM became a thing. And actually, the duty of care obligations of organisation is not just when you get on a plane and fly on a business trip. It's no matter where you are. So pushing for that workforce risk management component, I think, is really critical. Yeah, so that would be my takeaway.
Awesome. Yeah. Charlie.
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier. Just make sure that your travel risk partners are aligned with your travel provider, so that data is there to hand straight away when things start going wrong. And then the other crucial part for businesses is make sure that that individual's got a really solid communications plan that's signed off and agreed with the line managers, and it's about 3 layers deep, because that's, you know, you need to communicate with your staff. If stuff happens at your headquarters, how do you brief that out to your staff who are abroad?
Yeah, right. Nick?
I'm conscious that I stand between you and the final speech, so I'll keep it as brief as I can.
Why start now?
There are I build on two aspects that I brought up earlier on. The first, I think everybody on the panel at some point, in some way, shape or form, has alluded to the individual risk assessments, and I would re-emphasise that as key to any successful travel people risk management programme, but also in the internal stakeholder landscape. And I know that there were a huge number of consultants in the room accurately mapping that internal stakeholder landscape is going to go a huge way to helping build an effective programme.
Okay, what I'll offer you is this. The Association of Security Consultants has a YouTube channel where there are dozens of presentations that have been recorded in situations like this or webinars. Each one of the presentations today will be put up in isolation as a presentation, as will this panel. So, to come back and review pieces forward past bits where Nick was talking and just come to other stuff, that is available. There are two things that I wanted to just mention. I said at the beginning, this is about learning things that you don't necessarily know about. Many of you will be specialists in counterterrorism or in technology, installations, people, personnel security. This is a different theme. The ASC is trying to offer more in terms of wider knowledge so that you become more well-rounded. You might never, ever give this advice, but at least it fits into other things that you know. So I congratulate you on being here. And for everybody that was here earlier on, because continuing professional development is absolutely essential if you call yourself a professional. If you're not continuously learning, don't tell me that you're a professional because I will laugh. And I say that with some very resound backing. And I'm going to read this from my AI generated because it'll say it better than me. Because there are two things that I think really resonate with me. Socratic ignorance. This is a concept attributed, obviously, to the philosopher Socrates. And he said, I know that I know nothing. And this wasn't meant to be taken literally, but rather to express the idea that the more that you learn, the more you realize the vastness of what you don't know. And if you don't come to things like this, you never realize that you don't know much about this. And nobody in security knows everything. If they say they do, then just walk away. So the pursuit of knowledge, therefore, leads to a greater awareness of one's own ignorance. Now, this leads on to something that Gary Evanson actually brought to my attention. And he is doing his PhD research into whether our industry is a profession or not. No doubt it's full of professional people and many unprofessional people, but is it viewed as a profession and how do we make it so in society? And he raised with me this concept called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And it's a cognitive bias where people with low competence in a particular area overestimate their ability. Now, I know that we all know people like that. Conversely, as people gain expertise, they become more aware of the complexities and nuances of their field, which can lead them to underestimate their own abilities. This aligns to the idea that increased knowledge can lead to a greater awareness of what you don't know. And it's like a bell curve. So the Dunning-Kruger effect, if you Google this, will show you a bell curve. And it's got at this one side here, so it's going this way. At this side here, you've got somebody that thinks they know everything, but they don't know, really. They're sitting back on the laurels of what they knew. I don't know, maybe they did 22 years in the military, and 15 years down the line, they've done no CPD, so they're as competent as they were when they left. But things have moved on. If you start learning through CPD or diplomas or degrees, your level of knowledge goes up, but there is a correlation that the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know because there's a vastness of information out there. Events like this are designed not to teach you how to be travel risk managers. They're designed to show you that there's a lot more to learn about it. And so the reason I asked them for their top tips at the end is so that should you wish to know more about it, you go away and learn more about it. You can, go online and look at International SOS, Sibylline, Peoplesafe, work out, what they're offering, learn more about it, see them at shows, speak to them in the foyers and that sort of thing, because that's the only way that we learn. Now, I'll get off my perch because I feel like I'm preaching a little bit, but it is really important because that's why you join an association like this. And we couldn't do it unless people like this develop the presentations, put the work and time and effort into creating something bespoke for you, and then delivering their expertise for your benefit. So one last round of applause, please. Future events, very quickly. These are seasonal. There are 4 of these business groups there. We call them business group conferences now because they've become bigger than they ever were. The next one's on the 6th of May. We're going to be covering off public space safety and security. Obviously, it's going to tie very much into publicly accessible locations, protect duty, technology and defensive architecture that protects people, and then the thought leadership around it. We are taking ideas on presentations for people, so if that's your bag, then please reach out to us. We have an event co-located with Security Matters Live at the Rico Arena in June 12th of, I think, might be the 5th. It's Security Matters Live, big conference in Coventry. We have a side conference on that where we're going to focus on what it means to be consultant. How do you market your brand? How do you look at your verticals? How do you finance yourself? How do you know what you're pitching to who and what kind of client you've got? All that sort of thing is going to be discussed alongside the security conference that the guys at Security Matters will be running. Then we have a table at the event. If you fancy sponsoring that side group at the Rico, then we will invite you to our table at the dinner as well, which is not cheap, obviously, but we'll throw that in. And then, we'll see you hopefully at the security event up in Birmingham in April, where we will be exhibiting and hosting the security leadership stage. Lee Doddridge will be leading on that on our behalf. So please come along and support the guys at that. For today, we're wrapped up. Thank you very much for your time and safe journey home.